Okay, so we are live. Hello, everyone. Good to see you all in the virtual audience. So welcome to the last but one Riot Science Club of the year. We're very thrilled to have the penultimate talk given to us by Louise Connell, who will give a talk on open data and ethics. But before we go on to that, we will just do a few announcements. The first is our speaker for next week is going to be Dr. Matt Wall, and he will give a nice 2-hour run through of fMRI analysis for beginners. It's at 3 till 5 GMT on the 15th of December, so the Tuesday, as opposed to our regular time on Thursday. You can, if you like, sign up to the workshop with the link. So just go to our website page, www.rightscience.co.uk, or you can also go through to Matt's Twitter page as well, and you will find at some point on his thread a link to the Google Sheet where you sign up to. For anybody who has missed a previous Riots Club, please do check out our YouTube channel. You can see all of the videos from before. And we've also created playlists as well, so that people can focus on talks that are for specific areas of open science and reproducibility and the like. For just a few housekeeping roles before I introduce our speaker for today. In the Q&A message board, I will upload a link to a Google form, which is a survey that we're rolling out to get an idea of people's feedback of how well we're doing. We really value your feedback, and we really want to make next year's Rights as best as possible. So it'd be a great opportunity to hear directly from you all. I'll also open the Q&A message board so that everybody can ask questions throughout the talk, and then, as usual, we will compile and feed the questions to Louise towards the end of the talk. So with that all said, I'll start introducing our speaker, as we're all keen to hear from Louise. So Louise's research interests mainly surround cognitive science and embodied cognition. Specifically, she's interested in how mental representations and conceptual knowledge are grounded, and how we assess and use these representations in language, how we can create computational models to better understand human cognitive behaviour. She uses a range of interdisciplinary methods, and from experimental psychology and cognitive modelling to corpus linguistics and machine learning. Some of her recent work has examined how sensorimotor experience underpins word meaning, how distributional statistics from language capture important information about conceptual and social knowledge. And obviously, in her extensive research experience, she's had to deal with the kind of thorny topic of sharing your data and being transparent, but also trying to square the circle with ethical guidelines and requirements and GDPR guidelines too. And so we're going to learn a lot more about her experience and how she can give us a sort of roadmap to help us navigate through those barriers that we face in our routine workflow. So Louise, I can see you've started sharing your desktop, which is great. I will then hand over to you. So thank you again for giving time to this, and I look forward to hearing your talk.
Okay, thank you, Sam. Thank you for inviting me to this. So joining an online live event is a first for me, and let's see how it goes. So hello, everyone. And yes, as Sam had said, I have come across quite a few thorny issues on the way. So my hope is, as I talk to you about the experiences that I have had, it might help some people who might find themselves in similar situations. Because one thing I've found a lot is that people tend to have to reinvent the wheel over and over again when it comes to kind of the nitty-gritty of how to solve problems within open science, within particularly data sharing. So hopefully this will go some way to countering that. So there's loads of different ways to conceive of open science, and I particularly like this one, where open research data, if you like, is 1/3 of the 3 components that make it up. So you tend to find that difficulties in, open access to publications, whether you go with the gold or the green route, that's well discussed. Different ways of opening up the community is also well discussed. But apart from a kind of a token, oh yeah, you should share your data, the discussion often doesn't go into much depth. So what the perspective that I'm coming from is that I tend to work overlapping a lot with the kind of things that big data researchers have to cover. So big data just generally means, in the sense of psychology, dealing with data sets that are several orders of magnitude bigger than usual. So you might not be talking about terabytes of data the way pure data scientists do, but you might be talking about having 20 or 30,000 items in a study, as opposed to having like 100 or 200, that kind of thing. And the reason that I'm mentioning this is because a lot of the problems that big data researchers come across, I have found really useful. They've solved the problem in different fields already, and I've been able to borrow some of their knowledge and techniques in solving my own issues. So the kind of things that I do, open data that's straightforward to do, are things like your typical behavioural study. That's fine. If you have a study that involves doing audio or visual recordings and you have some kind of coding of that results in an alphanumeric anonymous data set, fine, you can code that. You've also got some forms of aggregate analysis. So even if participants are identifiable at the individual level, once you've aggregated the data, they're now anonymous. You can share that. In big data, then, as the size of the data sets get bigger and bigger, word image norms, behavioural mega studies, as they're called, like where you're testing hundreds and hundreds of participants instead of under 100. And also things like the raw data from ERP or videos or neuroimaging. These are sometimes shared, but most often not. And I've run into issues trying to share audiovisual data in particular that I'll be talking about today. So one of the first issues that I came across was the difference between open data and kind of half open data. So the data might be available, but it's not all mine, and you start running into copyright issues whenever you want to share the entire thing. So the main problem is that open data or available data, it's not just a binary thing. It's not either open or closed. There's a whole continuum of degrees of openness, where if you're just, for example, sharing with a CC BY, Creative Commons license, it's fine. Everybody can use it, do what they want with it, so long as they acknowledge the source. Great. Whenever I see that, my problems are solved in advance. That's the easiest thing to deal with. Some people also use it with CC BY with an NC, so no commercial use is allowed. I'm not using it for commercial use, so that's also straightforward. But these kind of things have only become common recently. I've tried to use data that's a little bit older, and it's where you have, it might be available from somebody's website, but they've marked it down as being their copyright from a few years ago. So it might be fine for you to download and use it, but if you try to share that again, well, perhaps you can't under the basis of whatever the creator thinks is copyright. And then you start getting into more formal things. What if you have published a set of norms years ago, or you're using somebody else's set of norms from years ago, where the data itself has been shared as part of supplementals, so it's folded into the copyright agreement of that particular journal. It's available, but the ability to reshare it again, it's messy and it's not clear. And then of course you have certain types of items. One particularly very well known set of psycholinguistic norms that has an incredibly restrictive copyright set. You can use it, it's freely available for academic use, but only for research. It explicitly says that you cannot use any of these items in teaching, you cannot make these available to the general public, you cannot share them at all whatsoever, ever. So available does not equal open, certainly not open for sharing. So this would be a typical kind of data set of mine, usually for some enormous mixed model regression, or occasionally principal components analysis, something like that. Loads of variables, tens of thousands of cases. But of these variables, a lot of them are mine. Perhaps I have created them, but most of them are not. Most of them, I have taken these measures from elsewhere because, well, for psycholinguistic norms, that's the kind of thing that they're there to do. So say I have run this wonderful study, I've got the thing written up, I want to share the data, deposit the data before I submit for publication. Can I? Well, it's not clear. Some of the stuff might be recent of mine. I know for definite it's okay to share because I have deposited it as CC BY licensing. I already know it's fine. However, some of the stuff, perhaps, maybe it's mine, maybe it's somebody else's, it's the supplemental data attached to an article that is under publisher copyright. And it's not clear whether I have the right to deposit that when I put my data set into a public archive. Also in there, you've got that data that I can use that's apparently copyright to a lab from 10 years ago. Do I have the right to share that? I have the right to use it, but maybe not to redistribute. And then, of course, you've got the variables where, nope, absolutely no resharing is allowed. It explicitly says I cannot make them public. So now we have a problem, because the whole point of me wanting to deposit and share my data is so my analysis is reproducible. It's so what I am doing can be run by other people. And if I have to cut out chunks of the data because I don't clearly have the right to share them, then my analysis isn't reproducible anymore. And one of the fundamental reasons for sharing the data has just gone up in smoke. And I've come across this problem so often, and I've never seen anybody else discuss it. So we have had to find our own way through this particular maze. Sorry, that's repeating. For solutions, I have found actually begging permission is quite useful. Hunt down the creator that copyrighted it to their lab 10 years ago and ask, can you include their data when you deposit yours? Sometimes I found you have to explain the whole concept of data sharing from scratch, the whole concept of why this might be a good thing to do and why it might be a very valuable thing to do. But generally speaking, we've had excellent luck doing this, even in a couple of cases of where the data was closed and was originally distributed with an absolutely do not share. We have managed to get permission from the creator to include it when we deposit our data. In one memorable case, it took emailing about 8 or 10 people to locate the data creator who had retired like 15 years ago. But she did give permission, so we were allowed to use it. So it can be a lot of work, but if you hunt them down and they give your permission, you have the right to include the whole thing. When it comes to supplemental materials attached to journal articles, where it appears to come under the publisher copyright of the journal publisher, we have never got a straight answer as to who owns that copyright. The journals have bounced us to the publishers have bounced us to the journals. Often when we check with the authors, they'd be happy to share it, but they're not sure about the copyright. So, well, in a couple of cases, we have just gone ahead and shared it because the author thinks it's okay and nobody else said no. But we perhaps might be walking a fine line there. And if you can't get a clear way through, you might have to resort to the data available from author on request route instead of depositing it in advance. I think it's not great, but it's better than nothing if you really do respond to those requests. Distributing privately, distributing research data from one researcher to another is usually permissible even in the case of the extremely restricted data sets, the restricted copyright. We haven't had to resort to this in a long time, but it's always there as a backup. More long-term, though, is just set about avoiding the problem. So set about making sure you don't make it a problem for anyone else. Use data repositories, use OSF or Zenodo or GitHub or whatever your preferred repository is, instead of attaching it as supplemental materials to the article. Lots and lots of journals are very keen for you to attach your data as supplementals. I would just advise don't, having been through the mess of trying to ascertain copyright permissions to share that data again if you use it in another study. It's just much, much clearer if you drop it on OSF and say this is CC BY. And also, yes, use a really explicit Creative Commons license. If you like, you can even put it in the paper itself. Data is available at this link under CC BY. So you can make it clear at the manuscript level even that the data is available and reusable, instead of having people have to hunt through something in OSF framework to find out what precisely the sharing conditions are. Not everybody is familiar with OSF, and sometimes it can be, shall we say, not the most user-friendly for novices that you're trying to explain things to. So being able to state in a manuscript what the licensing conditions for your data sharing are will make it easier for other people to use it. And also, I'd say don't add on silly clauses. I've come across quite a few of the copyright from my lab 10 years ago, where people have done things like, you can use it only if you tell them what the study is about. You can use them only if you inform the data creator who you are and they say it's okay to use it. Because these kind of things will just create trouble down the road when you move institutions, when you retire or leave academia or get hit by a bus or something. Don't add on those clauses. And most people don't these days. Most people who are really embedded in open science culture won't do it, but sometimes it does still happen. So that's it for problem one. Problem two, as Sam alluded to earlier, is, well, when data sharing runs into conflicts with data protection. So using a specific example that we came across, I've got a big project on at the moment where some of the studies in it involve recording either the voice or the full video of recordings of participants. And I would like to deposit these as well as the alphanumeric data that results when you mark up this kind of raw data. And that's a problem. Most people have encountered GDPR at some point. Most ethics applications will require you to address data protection in some shape or form. And the interpretations of GDPR differ not only from institution to institution, but also from individual to individual. And I wish it didn't happen like that, but well, it does. Also, the case is that grant reviewers will frequently flag these things as part of data management issues. Reviewers will flag them. Sometimes the grant panel themselves will demand some sort of data management plan to show that you are GDPR compliant. It's a lot more awkward than it might first appear when you're saying that you want to share raw audiovisual data. So just to take a typical example, you submit an ethics form. You know, all the consent stuff in ethics is for participation in the study and also to let you record people's data in the first place. Recording anonymous data, absolutely fine. Generally no problem. Recording and storing personal data, so even things like a consent form would be personal data. They're also covered by ethics and always have been. There's nothing new. What is new is if you want to share that personal data publicly, and things like audio and visual recordings, this is personal data. And this is where GDPR comes in. GDPR has got nothing to do with anonymous data. That's fine. But it does have a lot of things to say about personal data. And the reason that this becomes an issue is because, say, ethics reviewers or data protection people in your institution, they're used to the idea that, okay, it's all about recording, storing, sharing anonymous or personal data, but you're not going to share the personal data. There are things like consent forms that are tucked away and kept confidential to the group. In GDPR terms, there's a legal distinction between the basis you use to record and store personal data like consent forms and the legal basis for sharing personal data like audio and visual recordings. And that's a big distinction that I'm not going to go into in detail, but it matters because the rules that govern whether you can or cannot store things like consent forms, they apply quite differently when you want to ask, but can I share this video recording of my participants? And I'm just going to focus on this type of one today, where consent from the participant forms the basis for letting you share most data publicly in this form. So for example, if you have, it could be your own institution ethics committee, it could be in some cases the grant funders ethics committee, so it could be NHS or it could be the ERC. You have to pass ethics at multiple levels outside your institution. Any one of those, or your data protection officer or grant reviewers, they might all raise objections or queries about something you're saying you'll do in the study. And one example is people saying that photos, videos, voice recordings, this is GDPR special category data. This is the kind of thing that used to be called sensitive personal data. So it has to be kept confidential to the research team. There's no question you cannot share it. But actually that's not true. GDPR, having read the entire directive more than once, is actually very, very explicit that things like audio and visual recordings or photographs, they are not special category data because they're not for biometric identification purposes. And that's the key word to use. They're not for biometric identification. And because they're not, it means that as long as participants explicitly consent to you sharing that audio or visual data, that's okay. You can share. It's not special category, so you are allowed to share it with consent. Alternatively, you might get someone saying that, but no, wait, you've got a photo or video that contains visual clues that reveal some of these special categories of personal information. Someone's race might be visible from it. There might be cues in clothing or accoutrements that cue you to their religion. You might be able to deduce some health conditions from it. This is special category data. It could be inferred, therefore you can't share them. But again, this is not special category data. It's not for biometric identification. So although these cues can be deduced, it does not mean it's in special category. And just like before, as long as participants explicitly consent, you can share it. You might also get people objecting to the fact that, but people can be identified by their voice or definitely from their photo and video. And that means you cannot place them in a public repository. No way. But again, identifiability, it's not a barrier. There is nothing in GDPR that says that you cannot share stuff like this. As long as participants explicitly give their consent for you to place it in a public archive, you're allowed to do it. And the last, well, not the second last, is that I've had people object to saying that, no, you can't share these voice and video recordings. What if people start discussing personal things? What if they discuss their political views or their sexual orientation or their health status or their criminal past or anything that falls under special category? And for me, I've always been able to say it doesn't. There is no question of ever discussing these kind of topics. The kind of thing that we're recording, they're closed responses to non-personal questions. So as long as participants explicitly consent to it, we can share that data. You might also need to add that if participants go off-piste and start talking about all this stuff, even though we don't ask for it, that participant will be excluded from the study and we won't be sharing their data. So you can always put that in as a caveat. And then the last part is that it's not something that has come up for me personally, but I have been asked about it a couple of times. And this is, what if your study does involve participants discussing this stuff? What if they do discuss one of the topics that touch off special category information? In that case, your ethics committee or your data protection officer might demand that this stuff is kept confidential. And this is tricky. This is not somewhere that I would give advice on because there are too many things to consider. So there could be later damage or distress to participants if they regret making it public. If you're doing medical research, you could run into conflicts with patient consent. Basically, if you're in this kind of situation, get specialist advice. It's possible that explicit consent is sufficient, but it might not be. So basically, for solutions then to this kind of issue, make time for long conversations and many back and forths with local ethics and data protection, and maybe not even local. I have an ERC grant where I had to pass ethics through the ERC ethics panel, and that went on for months before the grant could even start. So just be prepared for it and make sure you know your stuff. Oh, and then I had to go through it all again locally as well, but still. Yeah, be prepared for delays. One thing we have found that has been cleared by all our levels of ethics, and we have used it and it works, is to get explicit consent for participants to publicly share audiovisual data. So what we used, there's an example of it on the slide. It's an opt-in consent form for sharing audiovisual data. So people have the usual consent form to take part in the study, and in the way we do it, we don't let participants take part in the study unless participants are happy to share anonymous alphanumeric data from the study. So sharing the anonymous coded stuff is part of it anyway. So if they do agree to take part in the study with that type of sharing, we then add this form. And they don't have to agree here to any form of data sharing of their raw audiovisual in order to take part. It's entirely optional, entirely opt-in, and we state explicitly that your choice on this form doesn't affect your ability to take part. So for audio, we just give them the option of I agree to make it public and I waive all rights, or they can select I do not agree, I don't want to share it publicly in any form. For video, and we opted to give them an extra choice, which was to agree to sharing the full video where their face is visible, to agree to a version where their face is digitally masked, which is a bit of a pain to do, but it can be done relatively automatically. So we decided to give it as an option. Or they can tick, no, I do not agree at all. I don't want my video data shared. And if you have time to do a face masking option, or if you want to check out the software possibilities for doing it so you can judge if it's feasible, it's worth considering. Sorry, if you can hear cats meowing, yes, they're mine. So having used these forms, just to give you an example of the kind of uptake that we've had from the lab, one study of voice recordings that had 60 participants in it, we had 52 of them agree to share their data. 8 did not. So that paper is currently in submission somewhere, and all the data is on OSF, and the paper is on SciArchive if anybody's interested. And within this, we have on OSF the full alphanumeric coded data for everybody, and then 52 files of audio recordings that could be marked up immensely more than we did for the purposes of the study, so could be useful for other people as well. And it's not perfect. So if people want to go take our code book and mark up all of those audio files to reproduce what we did, they can do it for 52 participants. But it's enough, I think, for that to be useful for other people for different purposes. And then there was one on video recording, which we were recording people's actions with their hands, really. So there's no speech in these videos, but people's full faces are visible while they do this stuff at a table. And we used the form you saw on the previous slide, where they had 3 options. And what we found is that out of 92 participants, only 5 people said, nope, not happy about sharing this. And the remainder were split almost 50-50 between sharing full face and sharing masked face. So on the basis of that, I think that adding the option for facial masking, digital masking of the face, makes reluctant people a lot more willing to opt in to data sharing. So we're very pleased about that. And again, although it doesn't mean that our entire data set can be recoded with our code book if somebody wanted. I wouldn't expect the results to change by excluding those 5 people who chose not to share, so I'd be content with that. And then the last problem is, it's more of a general thing, but this is the difference between sharing your data properly in a useful form and dumping a load of data onto OSF with no thought. So this is something that I have heard people say where they're only thinking about data sharing where they're kind of at the point of writing up the paper. So they would be interested in depositing their data, but the data are a mess. They've not been curated properly. They've not been managed properly right from the start. And this is a really common thing to happen. So open data sounds great, but open data is not the same thing as properly curated data. Some of it is, but most of it isn't. And there have been a few studies kind of looking at open data, and when you look at the stuff that people deposit as supplemental materials or as archives on OSF or some other repository, how much of it is actually usable? How much of it is functional? Most of it isn't. Some of you might be familiar with the FAIR data principles, that FAIR data is a subset of curated data that meets a certain standard of being findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. A very tiny amount of open data meets FAIR data standards. Most does not. Instead, what you find when you just need to find data yourself, if you're looking, you read a paper, it's like, oh, they have the data available. You go get the data. It's like, wee, this barely seems to relate to the paper I've just read. Yeah, most data that's shared openly falls under the chaotic data kind of format. And it's everything that curated data is not. It's a mess. It's not understandable by anybody except the person who created it. It's theoretically available, but nobody's going to be able to reproduce analysis from it without a huge amount of effort and guesswork. And unfortunately, a lot of open data is in this chaos category. And one of the reasons for that, as I mentioned, is because if you think about sort of the life cycle of running a typical study in the old days and submitting a paper. So, you run your studies, whatever they are, you write them up, and that will probably go on a bit iteratively as you go along. Then when everything's done with the write-up, you finalize the manuscript with other co-authors and that kind of thing, and when it's finalized, you submit the paper, the end. To a lot of people who are trying to work open data into this kind of workflow, they sort of tag it on at the end. So when you're finalizing the manuscript or when you're agreeing stuff with your authors, you find the data that you analyzed earlier, you dump it in a repository, you add the link to your paper and you submit it. And when you do that, you end up, more often than not, unless you're an exceptionally organized individual just by default, which few academics are, you will end up with this chaotic data that's no use to anyone. Examples of the kind of things that go wrong, and these are ones I've encountered by painful personal experience. I've anonymized to some extent the data that I found, and these are all real live cases of, I've read the paper, it's like, oh, I want to check something in the data. I get the data, it's like, oh, this isn't going to do. And surveys, there are a few pieces of work out there that have looked at open data and shared data in psychology and in other fields, and these issues are endemic. A really common thing is sharing software-specific data files only. So you're sharing, for example, SAV, SPSS files, or even just sharing, people think that, oh, well, SPSS is proprietary. Of course, I won't share that data file. No, I'll just dump the entire OR data structure instead. It's like, no, that's still a problem. Share CSVs or tab delimited text or something that is absolutely plain numeric format. Don't do it as software-specific files. Now you can add them on as well as an option, but don't do it in the absence of plain format. Another really common problem is bad file names. Data 1, 2, 3 from a paper that has one experiment in it. It's like, it makes no sense. There's no mapping between what the paper says and what the data is when I go and follow the link. Another really common issue are bad variable names. Whatever people decided to call the variable names way back in the dark ages of programming the study or marking things up, they haven't changed them since. So these things like SI1 and SI2, SI3, and in the context of the study, it doesn't refer to stimulus interval or anything sensible. No idea what that is. Or people that seem to think that you can't have variable names longer than 4 characters. So everything gets crammed into these completely opaque abbreviations that don't match what's in the manuscript and aren't explained anywhere. This is really common and really annoying. But also what's disturbingly common is the data just aren't there. Not all of the data that is reported as being present. So all data is available on this link. You go there and half of the data that's reported in the manuscript has no counterpart in the data repository. That's very common. What's also quite common is calculated variables. So when you've used your stats software of choice to calculate a particular variable or on the fly for the analysis, or if you use it to do automatic filters for subsetting data, but these variables are not saved to the data file. That means that people cannot reproduce your analysis without trying to recreate your calculations and your filters. So your data is not reproducible in its current form. That is another big issue. So one example I just give there is that somebody mentions they excluded all items that were answered incorrectly by at least half of participants in the control condition. 4 items were excluded. Great, which 4 items? You just want to check which were the weird 4 items. But that's not in there. All you have is the trial data, and you'd have to do quite a bit of data prep and manipulation to discover, well, okay, participants in the control condition, filter down to their items, then do an item by item breakdown of how many were answered incorrectly, and then reduce it down to, okay, how many had a threshold under 50%? Oh, it's these items. You've already made it difficult, shall we say, for people to access a fairly important part of your data. And it's common and it's annoying. So what can you do instead? Well, back in this kind of workflow, this is what data curation that's embedded in your workflow from the start looks like. As you're running the studies, you're curating it for sharing. As you do that, you're creating metadata to explain it. As you do that, you're finalizing the data to be shared at the same time as finalizing the manuscript. You know, if you spin off an extra exploratory analysis for the manuscript, well, you make sure that it is curated like all your other data. And then you submit it to the repository at the time you submit the paper. Great. The thing is, this takes time. It takes a lot of time to do it properly, and more time than you might think. So just some examples that people from my lab have discovered over time is, well, some of these are what some early career researchers in my lab have reported to me, and some of them are ones I've observed myself. So I'm not saying this is how long it takes every time, but it's just examples of where unexpected delays can pop up. So things like, you know, creating a sensible file and folder structure, labeling everything properly, takes more time than you might think, even if you're writing scripts, or especially if you're writing scripts to automate it for yourself to a certain extent. Assuming that your participants have agreed to anonymous data being shared, you have to ensure everything is anonymized properly. And that means stripping things like IP addresses out of the files output by your original experimental program. People don't always know, but IP addresses under GDPR constitute personal data. So for the anonymous part, you have to strip them out. It takes time. Writing metadata, a README text file that explains what each variable is, where the files are, how to get them, takes time. Then other examples, you're finalizing the manuscript and you realize that the way you've used different names in the study for clarity than what you originally used when you were programmed the study. So now there's a mismatch between the two. Well, you could go back, relabel the variables to match what you call them in the manuscript. Just run your analysis code again so you have the output, save everything. Slow, but okay. Or alternatively, you might be just about to submit the manuscript when one of your 5 co-authors says, you know what, I think the way we've described this variable is ambiguous. We need to change the name, change the descriptor. And you agree, okay, yeah, you're right, that would be better. but now the descriptor doesn't match your data set. Not good practice. So you discuss over email what to do, and this drags on for a while, even though you all decide in the end, let's just leave the data alone, but clarify in the metadata what it means. Fine. It's just you have to agree this stuff with your co-authors. It takes time. And then most recently, since we're all working from home so much, thanks to COVID, OSF is not the most stable of platforms, and if you have a slow broadband connection, then it took one of my postdocs a week to upload audio files to OSF because of repeated crashes. So it just, all these things, delay. So what does it mean? Curating your data properly for useful open data sharing, it's time consuming. But you can do some things that are kind of the bare minimum that will help immensely, even if they're not, perfect, fair data standards. So at a minimum, it's just ensure all the data and the variables that you use in the analysis are present in the data sets that you archive. And especially, I'll just flag up OR filters there because it comes up repeatedly with my students where they've used system, but it's not part of the data file. So that's opaque to somebody who takes the CSV data file for analysis. And yes, save everything as CSV. You can always add other formats as optional, but make sure there is a full CSV version there. Often people intend to do it and go, oh yeah, of course, but then forget to do it in the end. So that should be the first thing that's considered. And also just name everything clearly. You either make sure that you have matched the file and variable names in your data set to what's in the manuscript, and clearly, so it's experiment 1 RT data, here it is. Don't use things like, if you're using difference stimulus onset asynchronies or something like that in an experiment, don't just call them SOA1, SOA2, SOA3. Use the actual durations as you have described them in the manuscript. So it's SOA of 150 milliseconds or something like that. It means that the variable is completely transparent to people who might want to reuse it in the future without having to go through your manuscript in obsessive detail to find out how long that duration actually is. Or if you don't want to match everything up, create a metadata README file or codebook file to explain everything and save it alongside the CSV. But more long term, it's just get into the habit of curating data, work it into the whole life cycle of your project planning. And I have found that in the kind of work we do, it's 10 to 20% extra time per study is needed to curate data properly. Now, that may vary according to the type of study you're running and the kind of analysis that you're running, the kind of data you have, but that, for our lab, that's what I have found is a reasonable estimate. It's also good to document this stuff, create lab templates so you and the people around you kind of know what to do for best practice. So have some rules for how you name your files, what kind of variable names to use. Have a checklist that you can run through before uploading everything to a data repository to make sure you haven't forgotten anything. And there's a couple of examples there just of it's a summary of what file names might be in your particular lab codebook. This is the one we use in my lab. I won't say it's perfect, but at least it's systematic, so all file names do follow this function. So include experiment numbers, always. Avoid obscure acronyms and abbreviations. Use spaces for readability unless it creates issue with your stats software. Any files that undergo major changes should be versioned, so include a version number. Or if you look below, there's a screenshot from OSF of what pretty clear structure, folder structure and file naming conventions might look like. So you have experiment 1, and it's lab-based taxonomy. That's the name of the experiment. And then you have experiment 1, data and code, experiment 1, main analysis, where you have the main analysis RT CSV file, and then a couple of OR environments for showing the analysis code. So you might notice here that like experiment 1 is repeated throughout. That means that when people save the CSV file locally, they're not just stuck with something that says like rtdata.csv. They know that it relates to experiment 1, because obviously there's multiple experiments in this paper. And if you just call your data or T data over and over again, it won't be clear when people download it what study it relates to. And then separately here, for example, there's a folder for raw data and preparation, so processing for removing errors and outliers and that kind of thing. So that would be a good, clear file structure. I would be quite delighted to see that if I went to go look up a data set from a paper I was reading. And this was created by one of my PhD students, Rens van Hoof. So thank you for that. It's a good example to be able to use. So if you get into good workflow habits like this, that you write your README metadata as you go along, when you're filtering stuff, you comment what you're filtering and why. Make sure that if you are saving filter variables, you don't just call them filter 1, filter 2, you use the variable name to say what is being done by it. Is it motor error removal? Is it outlier removal? Whatever it might be. As you're writing the manuscript and sharing it with co-authors in rounds, have your data for archiving alongside it and update it iteratively so you can make sure it always is consistent and reflects. There's lots of things you can do for good workflow habits if you allow that 10 to 20% extra time that you really do need. So in terms of what to do next, I guess most people will be familiar with open data and that they share their data to some extent. But I guess don't always assume that all data is easily made open. And this goes for your own data that you might be planning for a project, as much as when you're maybe reviewing a paper and they haven't made their data available and it's like, okay, why? Be prepared for people to have difficulty understanding why they can't share something. And there are ways through it. So try and future-proof what you're doing. Plan for open data before you apply for funding or apply for ethics or whatever it might be. Plan this stuff out and know what you can and cannot do under GDPR. I'd also say to set up local groups, so not just local colleagues in your field or local people that are interested in open data, but also there are people out there that are data curators for other reasons. So for example, it might be that your institution's library have data curators in there as part of the institutional data repository. Now, you might not use that repository, you might be using a third-party one like OSF, but they could still be very well versed in GDPR and have good communications with your institution's data controller to help you write these kind of management plans and arguments for why you can actually share your video data that you might not have had before. And of course, there's always social media, but I guess don't stop there. Social media is useful, but especially for Twitter, there's an assumption to think that Twitter is the world, and it's so not. So you'll get useful stuff there, but definitely don't stop there. Look outside that and share what you're doing with people on the ground, as well as just on social media. And that's it from me. Thank you very much for your attention. And the 4 people alongside are the people who are working on my current ERC grant, where we have encountered most of the issues I have talked about today, and they've all helped out in one way or another. So thank you for them.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Louise. That was a really nice soft landing into this very horrible mess that is a sort of Gordian knot of ethics, GDPR, and trying to do your best to share your data. And we've had a few people submit their questions to the Q&A message board. If you can, people in the audience, you can submit more questions if you like, and we can upvote. You can upvote questions that have already been asked, so we can prioritize those. So I'll just go in the order in which they were submitted for now, and I'll just read these aloud. So let me just take a look. Okay. Okay, so this is, so they start by saying it's anonymous. So this is slightly off topic, but I wonder if you could comment on open education materials. I'm a new lecturer, and I believe my university owns my lecture content, i.e. slides, which was fine before COVID. but now it's an entirely different story now. On top of the extra workload, it also means the university can reuse my recordings, etc. Or can I have control over its reuse?
This is a really messy one. And I don't know if this person is in the UK or not. If they are, I would very strongly recommend they get onto their union, because this is a repeated issue. So yeah, they're right that the materials that we create, so the lecture slides that you create, belong to the university if you have created them during your work hours using university equipment. If you do them at home on your own computer in your spare time, technically they're yours, but that's rarely the case. So the way that I have had union people explain to me the rights of recordings you've made where you're talking through your slides is that the university owns the slides that you show, but you own the performance rights of the delivery, and that they do not have the right to share your audiovisual presentation of teaching materials without your express permission. They cannot assume it's part of your contract to agree to share them, and they would need your permission to hold on to them and use them for a different cohort, for example. That's the advice I've gotten from the union. In my institution, that's their position. But I would definitely recommend talking to the union or whatever other level of protection you have, because I think that is a really sticky issue, and especially for precarious staff who might come in, design, teach a course, and then have their stuff reused again and again. Yeah, I would believe universities would do that, but there should be a means of stopping them.
Right, thank you for that, Louise. I think that's something I've asked as well on Twitter, just to get further guidance, because it is sometimes specified in the contract as well. At least that's where you're informed that who owns the rights to the content, but the nitty-gritty is obviously never communicated that well in the contract.
There's a big difference between the content of your teaching materials and the content of a performance. And we have been informed in my institution by the union that the audiovisual delivery, the recording of you doing the lecture, that is yours. The performance rights are yours. So only use the slide content.
Right. So check with the union then.
The union.
Okay, so thank you for that. So the next question is, actually, you kind of touched on this one. So you recommend using OSF to store data, but I believe there is a storage limitation. My university doesn't have the infrastructure to store big data, and so could you suggest any other repositories other than OSF to store data?
I have used Zenodo in the past, so that's the one that hangs off CERN. So they are used to storing big, enormous physics data sets. I don't know what their maximum limit is, but it's worth saying even within OSF, because we would, if we included everything in the project as a single component, we would hit that cap. But what you can do is just keep creating sub-components. So not just folders, but create components within OSF. And each component has a separate cap. So it is actually, unless you have an individual file that clears that limit, it is possible to still use it. But otherwise, yeah, Zenodo is quite useful. There are quite a number of other repositories that involve, they're commercial, and I'm just wary of commercial repositories because if they're no longer profitable, I don't know what their long-term future would be.
Right.
So yeah. Zenodo, I would recommend. It's very clear. It forces you to write a lot of detailed metadata, and its funding is secure for a long time.
And it also gives a, correct me if I'm wrong, does it give a DOI, and so you can cite it, in other words? Yeah,
it gives a DOI. Yeah.
Right. So that's really useful, because you can obviously cite that as a form of output.
Yeah, it's compatible with the FAIR principles, because it's searchable in its right as well, and all of that.
Oh, perfect. Okay, well, that's good. And for those who want to look at Courtney Soderberg's talk she gave a few weeks ago, which was an introduction to the OSF, and I think she did touch on the different sort of jargon terms like component and project and folders and subfolders and stuff. So I encourage you to watch that video to see how you can sort of stack multiple components into one project. Okay, so the next one is, I really like the idea of a standardized protocol for how files are organized and named, but it looks like you need sustained oversight to ensure the protocol is implemented and sustained. How can you help maintain that your students and staff follow your protocol?
Well, what I've done really is just issue it at the start, like this is how things work around here, and keep a copy of it. So we have a shared, actually using Box, because that was our institution's preferred system. It sits at the top level of the experiment folder, so it's there for checking every time. And I think everybody has drifted away from it once or twice, right, when they sent me stuff to look at, and then I just go, ahem, go back, label stuff properly, please, and then it's been fine. I think once you get into the habit of it, it becomes automatic. You don't need to think about it anymore. So it takes as long as people train themselves into doing it. But once they've done it once for one study, then it kind of gets automated after that.
Yeah, because I find that I try to do it even for myself, and it's like I've got a lot of enthusiasm at the beginning, but then I just quickly revert back to doing multiple underscores, file, last, final, and so on. But yeah, I think I know somebody else that almost does random spot checks as well, just to take a look at the data, see how it's going on, if there's any errors in the data being inputted, and naturally they check the file names. So having sort of a random policing is one approach.
I suppose I don't want to run my lab in a very top-down way. Like I don't want my PhD students and postdocs to think that I'm looking over their shoulder all the time, policing. So I'm kind of, if I spot something is wrong because they've asked me to look at data anyway, I'll be going, oh, and by the way, fix your file naming. It's not following conventions. Right. But I haven't to say that more than maybe twice to an individual, and yeah, 3 years in, they're fine.
Okay, right. Yes, no, I think that's a good approach. So there's two questions here, which I think we might finish on, unless there's any more that's coming through. And they're actually on the same topic, so I'll just give them to you together. So one is, what are your views on using synthetic data to work around some of the issues with anonymizing existing data? And then the second question, which is, I work with highly sensitive data that cannot be shared. Could you share your thoughts on the usefulness of synthetic data, please?
It's not a domain that I work in myself, so I've not had to deal with it in detail. I think I have yet to encounter an example from somebody else where I think synthetic data can substitute for the original data set. I think it can solve a very limited number of the reasons why people might want to access another person's data in the first place. So it could be useful in a small number of cases, but as a kind of systematic wholesale thing to do when your data is too sensitive to be shared, I'm yet to be convinced of its utility. For very sensitive data, there's always going to be cases where you genuinely can't share it. And in those kind of cases, stuff that I have seen being very useful are things like, so I'm thinking specifically of someone I know whose study involves individual patients, older adults talking through their experiences of their increasing dementia symptoms. So it's sensitive data, has a lot of it has a lot of special category information in there, shall we say, and they're not going to be sharing it. But what they are sharing are the transcripts of the speech where personal data has been removed. So for example, if somebody is referencing their husband or wife or son or daughter, that's been substituted with family member, and that's it. Right. Or where family member 1, family member 2, that kind of thing. Also, they've done things like, their full code book. So in some cases, they were marking up some of the gesture and facial expression stuff that people were using. So their full code book for marking that up, and the resulting data, that has all been shared. So I think there are some cases where people might want to see the original data, where looking at these anonymized transcripts and code books can substitute to a certain extent, can provide a lot of the information. Mm-hmm. So it's very dependent on style of data and data set and all of that. Mm-hmm. But there are things you can do that can satisfy the people some of the time who are looking to see your raw data in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can't really add anything to that. I think so Dan Quintana did a talk for the Rights Club, which is probably why we've been asked these questions. So he did a talk on synthetic data, and I can't recall exactly what his line was on this, but I think he views it as a synthetic data as utility in releasing data to help people sort of computationally reproduce your analysis pipeline, rather than as a surrogate data set for you to actually find the same results or verify your findings from the paper, which is a kind of different part of which hasn't really been spoken to today, which is more about the computational side as opposed to the actual data itself.
I mean, I would agree with that. So that would be one of the small subset of reasons where it can substitute. But the reasons for sharing data, I just think, are immensely broader than that. Yeah. And the reasons other people seek out other people's open data are much more varied than just computational reproducibility.
Yeah.
And there are other things you can do to meet the second kind of set as well.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think that's exhausted all of our questions. Louise, you've been a wonderful speaker and a really nice talk that I will definitely be revisiting throughout the many years to come, because I think it's just one thing that you do need to keep looking at. We will upload your talk to YouTube and your slides to our OSF. And now that I know that you can add different components, we can deal with the storage limitations on our own Rights OSF page. So thanks again for that. Remember, next week on Tuesday, everyone, we have Dr. Matt Wall giving us a sort of entry-level workshop on fMRI analysis. So do stay tuned for that. If you won't join us, have a lovely Christmas and a very happy New Year. And thank you again, Louise.
Thank you, Sam. Cheers, everyone.
Okay.